When you look back at the really massive economic collapses in history, we have this weird psychological habit of treating them like weather events.
Right, like they're just natural disasters.
Exactly. We talk about the Great Depression or the collapse of global trade in the 1930s as if they were just hurricanes. I mean, the traditional high school history book gives you this very clean narrative.
Yeah, the stock market crashed in 29, and then the waters naturally receded.
Right. And global trade simply dried up because, well, people had less money. It's always framed as this totally organic tragedy.
It is deeply comforting to think of it that way, honestly. Because if the collapse of the global economy was just the invisible hand of the market catching a terrible flu, then, nobody is really to blame.
It's just the tragic physics of economics playing out.
Right. But the moment you step out of those macro textbooks and into the actual physical archives from that era, well, the entire natural disaster theory just falls apart completely.
Falls apart.
Yeah. You stop looking at a tragedy of nature, and you realize you are actually walking through a meticulously planned crime scene.
Wow. Okay, so welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're opening up a piece of research that is fundamentally rewriting how we understand the death of globalization.
It really is.
We're looking at a working paper from the National Bureau of Economic Research. It's NBER 23164, put together by 4 incredibly rigorous academic researchers.
Yeah.
That's Alan de Bromhead, Alan Fernihough, Markus Lampe, and Kevin Hjortshøj O'Rourke.
A powerhouse team.
Seriously. And the paper is called When Britain Turned Inward, Protection and the Shift Towards Empire in Interwar Britain. And their mission here, the mission of this whole deep dive, is basically a total demolition of the accepted academic consensus.
Yeah, because for the last 25 years, the academic establishment has pushed a very specific, very stubborn narrative.
Right.
Mainstream economic papers, published throughout the 90s and 2000s, they repeatedly concluded that government trade policy in the 1930s, the tariffs, the quotas, all that political posturing didn't actually matter that much in the grand scheme of things.
Which is wild to think about. They just dismissed it.
Totally dismissed it. They argued that world income fell so drastically that the fragmentation of trade was just a symptom, just an inevitable retreat to safety based on historical inertia.
They essentially said the politicians were just like passengers on a sinking ship.
Yeah.
And all those discriminatory trade policies were just a sideshow.
Exactly. But this NBER paper takes that theory, sets it completely on fire, and replaces it with undeniable hard math.
I love that.
The state machine wasn't a passenger. It stood behind the curtain and actively, deliberately strangled the multilateral trade system with its bare hands.
And the stakes of this historical correction couldn't be higher for you listening right now. Because if you misunderstand what killed global trade in the 30s, you misunderstand the mechanics of global conflict today.
That's the real hook here.
Right. As we look at today's headlines, and just to be clear, whether you lean politically left, right, or center on modern trade policies, we are not taking a political side here.
Right. We're just looking at the math, the pure data.
Exactly. The data from 1933 gives us a completely neutral mathematical mirror to look into. So when you read the daily news about, de-risking or this sudden panic over decoupling.
Building safe supply chains.
Yeah. Safe supply chains exclusively among geopolitical allies. The return of massive tariff walls. Does it make you anxious?
It absolutely should.
Because looking at this research, the underlying script we are living through right now, it was written 90 years ago. The world didn't just stumble into the dark in the 1930s. Politicians actively built the walls that blocked out the light.
And to understand how they built those walls, we really have to look at how global trade mutated in the decade following the 1929 crash.
Mutated is the perfect word.
Right, because it didn't just shrink in volume, it fundamentally changed its shape. The whole world fractured into these paranoid, isolated little fortresses.
Let's talk numbers, because the numbers are staggering.
Yeah, let's look at the British Empire. Between 1929 and 1938, the United Kingdom's imports from its own empire didn't just hold steady, they skyrocketed. They went from 30.2% of their total imports up to nearly 42%.
That is a massive swing for a global superpower.
Yeah.
And it wasn't an isolated British phenomenon, right?
Not at all. France saw its imports from French colonies and protectorates more than double. It jumped from 12% in 29 to 25.8% by 38.
Wow.
And Japan is an even more extreme example. Their trade with their sphere of influence, places like Korea, Formosa, Manchuria, that shot up from 26% to a staggering 45%.
The entire world basically pulled up the drawbridges and retreated into their own imperial safe havens.
Exactly. But the central mystery is why this sudden inward collapse actually happened. Was it just a terrified world seeking a familiar safe haven? Or was it a calculated imperial conspiracy to lock out competitors?
And this is where the mainstream economists got it so wrong for so long.
Yeah, they really did. The economists of the last few decades smugly argued it was just natural. They relied on highly aggregated macroeconomic data.
Massive blurry numbers.
Right. And they concluded that since these countries already shared currencies, languages, and historical commercial ties, it was only natural they would trade more with each other during a global crisis.
I find that academic blind spot just fascinating. You have the top economic minds looking at global empires suddenly hoarding almost half of all their trade internally, and their conclusion is, well, the massive new government tariffs probably had nothing to do with it.
It's crazy.
It's totally crazy. Looking at macroeconomic data to understand surgical trade policies, it's like looking at your total credit card bill at the end of the year. You see, you spent $50,000, but you have no idea if you spent it on basic groceries, a new car, or a horrific gambling habit.
Exactly. To find the actual mechanism, to find the crime, you have to look at the itemized receipts.
Which brings us to the methodology of this paper. Because that is the exact flaw this NBUR team exposes.
Right. If you just look at the total volume of trade between country A and country B, you completely miss the mechanics of the economy. You miss the specific targeted tariffs on specific goods.
The invisible stuff.
Yeah, you miss the physical quotas, you miss the surgical strikes that dictate the flow of capital. The researchers knew they had to weaponize the micro data to crush this 25-year-old macro myth.
And the sheer scale of the arsenal they built is just staggering. They didn't just tweak a computer model.
No, they went into the physical archives.
Right. Dusty ledgers.
Literally, they pulled the annual statement of the trade of the United Kingdom. These are massive, incredibly detailed ledgers from a century ago, and they manually digitized 160,000 individual data points.
160,000. Manually.
Manually. We are talking about tracking trade flows across 42 different countries, year by year, from 1924 all the way to 1938.
Wow.
They isolated 847 individual product categories. We're looking at everything from raw sheep's wool and unrefined beetroot sugar to electrical machinery and chilled beef.
Imagine the nightmare of just harmonizing that data. Because, a product category classified one way in 1924 might be split into 3 different subcategories by some customs clerk in 1931.
Oh, the archival labor alone is a monumental achievement. They meticulously aggregated those 847 messy historical items into 258 perfectly consistent product categories spanning the entire 14-year period.
Which gives them this incredibly clean window into what actually happened.
Exactly. And furthermore, they utilized what economists call double fixed effects.
Okay, let's break that down without the jargon. What does that mean?
Basically, they controlled for both the specific characteristics of the exporting country and the specific year of the product. They stripped away all the macroeconomic noise, the fluctuating exchange rates of the 30s, the generic effects of the Depression itself.
They just deleted all the excuses.
They wanted the purest, cleanest cause and effect relationship in modern economic history.
And they found the exact moment the free market died. And the victim they focused on makes this even more dramatic, because Britain wasn't just any country.
No, absolutely not. For almost a century, Britain was the undisputed lighthouse of global free trade.
Right. Open markets were their international brand. I mean, yes, during World War I, they introduced a few minor tariffs for national security or pure revenue, like the 1915 McKenna duty on luxury goods or the 1921 Safeguarding of Industries Act. But their baseline policy remained overwhelmingly liberal.
Completely. Right up until 1930, the door to the British market was open.
But then, 1931 hits.
Right. In 1931, the panic of the Great Depression finally broke the political consensus. The free trade lighthouse was smashed from the inside.
The British government passed the Abnormal Importations Act.
Yeah.
And just the psychological framing of that name is chilling. abnormal importations.
Yeah.
It casts foreign trade, the very thing that built global prosperity, as a disease.
And an abnormality that requires an aggressive cure.
Exactly. So what was the cure?
The cure was unprecedented in modern British history. The Board of Trade was granted sweeping authority to slap a 100% tariff on foreign manufactured goods.
100%.
100%. Overnight, with virtually no warning, tariffs of 50% were actually imposed on a massive range of products. It was a blunt force trauma to international supply chains.
But the real architectural shift, the moment protectionism mutated into a calculated geopolitical weapon, that happened a few months later, right?
Yes. February 1932, with the Import Duties Act.
Okay, let's unpack this one.
They rolled out a sweeping 10% wall around the entire British market, a general tariff on almost every foreign good that wasn't already taxed.
But the brilliance, or rather, the sheer cynicism of the 1932 Import Duties Act wasn't the 10% wall itself. It was the specific, deliberate architecture of the exemptions.
Right. The act contained a massive loophole written directly into the legislation. Goods from the British Empire were completely exempted.
Which is the face-slapping moment here. Protectionism is almost always sold to the public as a shield for domestic industry, right?
Yeah.
You build a wall so your own factories and farmers can survive foreign competition.
That's the story they tell.
But the exemption list proves this wasn't about protecting domestic British producers from everything. It was a surgical strike. It's like a nightclub bouncing everyone at the door with a massive cover charge, unless you happen to carry a VIP card with the king's face on it.
That is a perfect analogy. And if you look at the physical items on that exemption list, the imperial agenda becomes undeniable.
What was on the list?
They exempted raw materials, raw cotton, raw wool, hides and skins, iron ore, scrap iron. They exempted crucial foodstuffs like meat and wheat.
Literally all the specific commodities that the outer rings of the British Empire, places like India, Australia, Canada, produced in massive quantities.
Exactly. So if you were a cotton farmer in the United States, you suddenly had a massive brick wall at the British port. But if you were a cotton farmer in British India, the doors were wide open.
They weaponized the tariff to physically reroute the global supply chain. They were artificially choking off the rest of the world to feed their own geopolitical bloc.
And that initial 10% was just the floor. The government established the Import Duties Advisory Committee, which had the power to pile on additional duties upon request.
Oh, wow. So they just kept adding to it.
They constantly layered new tariffs on foreign goods, and almost without fail, imperial goods were granted exemptions from these new layers too.
So when you lay out the physical mechanics of the 1931 and 32 Acts, the old academic myth that policy didn't matter just looks completely absurd.
Totally absurd. How can a researcher look at a 100% tariff on foreign manufactured goods, coupled with a total exemption for the empire, and conclude that the trade shifted simply because of historical inertia?
It's baffling, but it really highlights the danger of relying purely on aggregate models.
Right.
Until this NBER team digitized the individual product lines, no one had quantified the granular item-by-item impact.
Right. But as aggressive as those tariffs were, tariffs are really just the part of the iceberg you can see above the water.
Oh, here we go. The dark stuff.
Yeah. The real slaughter of the free market, the policies that actually bankrupted foreign producers, happened behind closed doors in the summer of 1932.
The Ottawa Conference.
Yes, July 21st, 1932. Representatives from across the British Empire descend on Ottawa, Canada. We're talking the UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Newfoundland, India, and Southern Rhodesia.
On paper, it's billed as this nice family reunion, a diplomatic summit for the empire to coordinate a survival strategy during the Depression.
In reality, it functioned like a mafia syndicate carving up global territory.
A mafia syndicate. I love that. How so?
Well, Britain sat down with the Dominions, primarily Canada and Australia, and essentially offered a stark proposition. They said, you want preferential, guaranteed access to my massive consumer market. You have to help me kill my foreign competitors in your own markets.
You scratch my back, I'll destroy your rivals.
Exactly. And the negotiations were notoriously brutal. Britain demanded better access and lower tariffs for its manufactured goods in the Dominions. In exchange, the Dominions demanded a guaranteed monopoly on the British food market.
They didn't just want a slight advantage, right? They wanted the margins of imperial preference locked into law.
Right. Britain literally signed away its own sovereignty. They agreed not to lower that 10% wall on foreign goods without the explicit permission of the empire.
It's a terrifying precedent.
It is, and this is the critical transition point in our historical crime scene. To satisfy Canada and Australia, Britain couldn't just rely on tariffs anymore. They had to transition to something much more insidious.
Non-tariff barriers.
Specifically, quotas.
Okay, let's break down the psychological and mathematical difference between a tariff and a quota, especially in the context of the 1930s. Because this is crucial. I get how a 10% tariff works. You arrive at the port, you pay a 10% tax, and you pass through. It's a hurdle.
Right.
But how is a quota fundamentally different?
Well, a tariff is a hurdle you can jump over if you are efficient enough. If you are a highly advanced foreign producer, you can innovate, cut your production costs, absorb the cost of the tax, and still sell your goods competitively.
Makes sense.
But a quota is a brick wall. A quota dictates the absolute maximum volume, say, 1,000 tons of a specific product allowed into the country.
So once that 1,000-ton crosses the border, the door is slammed shut.
Completely shut. It doesn't matter if your product is infinitely better or even if you offer it for free, it becomes literally illegal to bring it in.
And in a deflationary environment like the Great Depression, where prices are crashing globally anyway, a tariff loses its stopping power, doesn't it?
Exactly. A desperate foreign country might devalue its own currency, slash its prices to the bone, and easily flood your market, completely bypassing your 10% tariff wall.
But a quota is the ultimate kill switch.
Mm-hmm.
It severs the price mechanism of the free market entirely and replaces it with pure government engineering.
Precisely. Following the Ottawa Pacts in 1933, Britain unleashed these brutal quotas on foreign meat. We're talking frozen mutton, frozen lamb, chilled beef, and bacon.
And who were they targeting?
They systematically forced massive, highly efficient foreign agricultural producers to simply stop exporting. Denmark and Argentina were the primary targets.
Put yourself in the shoes of a farmer in Denmark in 1932. You have spent decades optimizing a hyper-efficient bacon industry specifically to feed the demand in London. You produce arguably the best, cheapest bacon in the world.
Yep.
And suddenly, London sends a diplomatic memo demanding you slash your exports to them by up to 35%.
It's devastating. And the justification was nakedly political. The British government explicitly published their policy hierarchy. They literally said, the home producer first, empire producers second, and foreign producers last.
They literally forced Denmark to slaughter its own pigs and throw the meat away, just to artificially manufacture market share for Canadian and Australian meat that cost more to produce and transport.
And they painted these demands with the incredibly cynical term voluntary export restraints.
Voluntary. What a joke.
The coercion was absolute. It was essentially voluntarily restrict your exports by 35%, or we will pass a law banning 100% of your sector.
While these foreign countries were suffocated by hard limits, the gates for the Commonwealth were left wide open.
Right. In the rare instances quotas were applied to Canada, the limits were set so absurdly high they never actually restricted a single shipment. The game was entirely rigged.
And this brings up a terrifying realization about the nature of these geopolitical trade blocs. There's this illusion that if you are inside the club, you are safe. If you are part of the empire, the walls protect you.
Ah, right, the loyalty myth.
Yeah, but protectionism relies on raw leverage, and that inevitably breeds political weaponization. Just look at the Anglo-Irish trade war.
Ireland represents the ultimate cannibalism of the empire. Technically, the Irish Free State was part of the imperial club during this era.
Right. Under the rules of the Ottawa agreements, they should have enjoyed all the VIP exemptions and open markets afforded to Canada or Australia.
But the politics went sour. Dublin and London got into a bitter dispute over land annuities, essentially debt repayments stemming from historical land acts. It was a pure political argument.
And London didn't just respond with diplomatic cables, did they?
No. They turned the massive economic machinery of the 1932 Import Duties Act against their own neighbor. They stripped Ireland of its imperial preference and slammed emergency punitive duties on Irish agricultural commodities.
Specifically targeting the heart of the Irish economy, which was live cattle.
Exactly.
Imagine being an Irish cattle farmer. You aren't involved in the political dispute over land annuities in Dublin. But your entirely legal integrated supply chain to Britain is suddenly vaporized because a politician in London decided to use your livelihood as a bludgeon.
The rules of the market disappear. The VIP card is revoked.
Between 1932 and 1938, Ireland was subjected to a grueling economic siege by its supposedly closest trading partner. It just shows that if you aren't politically perfectly aligned, your closest ally becomes a meat grinder.
It's brutal. So we have established the mode of imperial consolidation and the weapons, which are the targeted tariffs and the quotas. Now, the NBER researchers had to execute the hardest part of the investigation. The math. They had to quantify exactly how much of the trade collapse was caused by these specific policies rather than just the general economic misery of the depression.
Right, isolating the variables.
And to do this, they calculated the price elasticity of demand across all 160,000 data points.
Okay, let's translate price elasticity out of the academic realm. At its core, elasticity is just a measure of how sensitive human behavior is to a price change. Right.
Yes. How easily do buyers panic and run away to a competitor when the price bumps up?
Right. If a tariff pushes the price up by 1% and demand drops by 1%, you have a one-to-one relationship. But what makes this database so incredible is that it reveals how different commodities behave entirely differently under pressure.
Absolutely. The researchers utilized an advanced structural gravity model to process this, and when they ran the numbers, they found that raw materials had an insanely high price elasticity. The coefficient was negative 17.47.
Negative 17.47. That is an incredibly explosive reaction.
It really is.
It means that if a British tariff increased the price of foreign raw materials, like, say, American iron ore or Egyptian raw cotton, by just a tiny fraction, British buyers immediately bolted.
Instantly. They dropped their foreign suppliers and switched to the cheaper, tariff-free imperial suppliers in India or Australia.
And the mechanism there is just simple substitution, right?
Exactly. Raw cotton is essentially raw cotton. Iron is iron. A British factory owner doesn't care about the national origin of the scrap iron melting in their furnace.
If the American iron suddenly cost even 5% more because of the 1932 general tariff, brand loyalty doesn't exist.
The market for raw materials was hypersensitive, and the tariff wall was devastatingly effective at rerouting those supply chains to the empire.
But here's where the data tells a completely different story. The elasticity for agricultural goods was much, much lower. The coefficient was only negative 5.17.
Which is a huge difference. Agricultural products and foodstuffs are deeply tied to consumer preference, and they have highly specialized, hyper-efficient supply chains.
British consumers had specific tastes. They preferred the quality of Danish bacon. They relied on the immense volume and consistency of Argentine chill beef.
Right. Which means that when the 10% tariff hit foreign food, British buyers didn't abandon it anywhere near as quickly as they abandoned raw materials.
The foreign farmers in Denmark and Argentina were so deeply efficient that they could actually absorb the cost of the British tariff, lower their own profit margins, and just keep selling their meat to London.
The tariff wall wasn't high enough to stop the food.
It's amazing.
And this mathematical reality perfectly explains the sequence of historical events. The politicians in London realized by late 1932 that their tariffs were failing to block foreign agriculture.
The empire producers were still losing to the sheer efficiency of South America and Scandinavia.
That is exactly why they had to deploy the quotas in 1933. They needed the brick wall.
But that creates a massive problem for the researchers, doesn't it? I mean, I can easily measure a 10% tariff. But how on earth do economists translate a physical limit? Say, a quota capping bacon imports at 100,000 tons into a percentage tax equivalent. What is the mathematical mechanism for unmasking an invisible wall?
This is where the structural gravity model shines. The researchers looked at the actual trade flows of the specific agricultural goods that were hit by quotas.
Okay.
The gravity model allows them to predict what the trade volume should have been, based on the size of the exporting economy, the geographical distance, historical trends, and fluctuating exchange rates.
Ah, I see. So they have a baseline.
Exactly. They compared this predicted baseline against the artificially depressed actual volume that was caused by the quota. By determining how much of a tariff it would mathematically require to cause that exact same drop in volume, they calculated the ad valorem equivalent, the AVE.
They translated the physical quota back into a tariff percentage.
They did, and the number they uncovered is staggering. The math proves that these agricultural quotas acted like a colossal, invisible 25.9% super tariff.
Nearly 26%.
Nearly 26%. And remember, that is layered on top of the existing chaos of the Depression.
They put a chokehold on the most efficient agricultural sectors in the world, painted it to look like a friendly, diplomatic, voluntary restraint, but in reality, they were hitting foreign farmers with a 26% invisible tax.
A tax that didn't even generate revenue for the British Treasury.
Exactly. It simply destroyed value. It severed the highly optimized supply chains of South America purely to prop up the politically favored, inefficient producers inside the empire.
With the mechanisms fully exposed and the elasticities calculated, the researchers moved to the final devastating phase of the paper.
The counterfactual simulations.
Right. They used their model to basically play God with history, to isolate exactly how much blood is on the hands of the policymakers.
Okay, let's look at simulation number 1, freezing the 1930 tariffs. Imagine an alternate universe. The stock market still crashes. The Great Depression still ravages global incomes.
What?
But the politicians in London do not panic. They don't pass the Abnormal Importations Act. They don't sign the Ottawa Mafia Pact. They don't unleash the bacon quotas. Trade policy remains frozen exactly as it was in the open market days of 1930.
If the 1990s academic consensus was right, if the shift to imperial trade was just a natural retreat to safety driven by historical inertia, then the empire's share of British imports should still skyrocket in this simulation.
Right. So what does the hard data say?
The data utterly rejects the consensus. In our actual reality, the empire's share of British imports surged to 39% by 1935.
Okay.
But in the simulation where the politicians keep their hands off the dials, the empire's share barely creeps up. It only hits 32%.
Wow. That is the death blow to the myth of the natural disaster. If you look at the critical window between 1930 and 1933, the researchers proved that a massive 70% of the shift toward the empire was directly mathematically caused by the new tariffs and quotas.
70% of the shift was artificially engineered by the state.
That is undeniable.
The remaining 30% represents the natural market shifts, the currency changes, and the geopolitical fear that earlier economists over-indexed on. But the overwhelming driving force was cold, hard government intervention.
And the researchers push it even further with simulation number 2, absolute free trade.
This one is fascinating.
They ask, what if Britain hadn't just frozen its 1930 policies, but actually stripped away all legacy tariffs? What if they were a true 100% free trade nation without any imperial preference at all?
The results of the simulation dismantle the entire economic mythology of the British Empire.
How so?
If Britain had pursued pure free trade, their massive, dominant imperial trade network would have practically evaporated. The simulation shows the empire's share of British imports plummeting to somewhere between 13% and 25%.
The entire concept of the British Empire as a naturally unified, self-sustaining economic bloc was a synthetic hallucination.
It was an illusion sustained entirely by government force.
The economies of the empire couldn't actually compete on an open global market. They required the mother country to violently strangle foreign competitors just to keep the imperial supply chains afloat.
Without the 10% general tariff and the 26% invisible quota tariffs, British families would have simply bought their food and materials from the most efficient producers on Earth.
Regardless of whose face was on the flag.
Exactly. The evidence is overwhelming. However, the defense lawyers for the traditional academic consensus have one final, highly technical alibi.
Yes. The argument of endogeneity.
Right.
The apologists will say, okay, fine, we can see the tariffs caused the trade to shift, but you are ignoring this sequence of events. The politicians only raised those tariffs because imports were dropping so catastrophically. They were merely reacting to a collapsing market, throwing out life rafts to save the domestic economy.
It's the argument that the market collapse caused the policy, rather than the policy causing the collapse. It's a standard defense in economic history.
But the NBER researchers anticipated this, right? And they tested it rigorously.
Who did?
If the politicians' defense is that they were just reacting to the market crashing, then mathematically we should see a direct correlation. The specific goods that saw the most severe drop in imports leading up to 1931 should be the exact same goods that received the highest, most aggressive tariffs in 1932.
That's the logical assumption.
If you plot that on a scatter plot graph, with the drop in imports on the horizontal axis and the new tariff size on the vertical axis, you should see a clear, tight trend line. So did the researchers actually find that line?
They did not find a line. They found a shotgun blast.
Shotgun blast.
When they ran the regression analysis to check for this correlation, the R-squared value, which is the statistical metric that tells you how much one variable explains another, was practically zero.
Zero.
Exactly zero. There's absolutely no statistical relationship between the prior market conditions of a product and the tariffs the government subsequently chose to slap on it.
That is the ultimate smoking gun. It is vanishingly rare in macroeconomic history to find a data set that clean.
It proves intent. The politicians were not reacting to the economic reality of the market. They were actively ignoring it to break the system.
They were picking winners and losers based on pure political agendas and imperial lobbying, completely divorced from the actual import data. The tariffs were a premeditated choice.
And that brings us to the abyss, the historical loop. We have to ask what this structural rewiring actually achieved and what it cost the world.
Let's look at the lose-lose circuit that this state intervention created. By weaponizing their trade policy, Britain forced its own citizens to abandon cheap, high-quality Danish bacon and highly efficient Argentine beef.
Which is wild when you think about the context.
Right. British families, in the middle of a crushing economic depression, literally paid more money for worse food, strictly to prop up politically connected producers in Canada and Australia.
And the macroeconomic result was devastating. Did closing the imperial loop save the global economy? No. The circle just got smaller.
The illusion of safety went up within the borders of the empire, but the actual fundamental efficiency of the global market was destroyed.
The entire globe sank deeper into isolation, retaliatory tariffs, and economic depression.
The multilateral trade system, the foundational idea that all nations can trade freely, efficiently, and interdependently, was murdered. And when you destroy economic interdependence, you remove the financial cost of going to war.
Yeah.
You pave the exact road to the political crises of the late 1930s.
As we look at the patterns in this data, the historical mirror to our present moment is, well, it's terrifying.
It really is. The terminology constantly evolves. In the 1930s, they spoke of imperial preference and abnormal importations.
Today, we speak of de-risking, friendshoring, and strategic decoupling.
The mechanisms have evolved from physical meat quotas to semiconductor export controls and digital tariffs. But the underlying human instinct, the political reflex to build exclusionary walls when we feel threatened, remains exactly the same.
When the global community obsesses over building high walls and closing its circles into trusted geopolitical blocks, it is perfectly replicating the disaster trajectory of 90 years ago.
The illusion is that state intervention and market manipulation will create safety. But the reality, mathematically proven by the 1930s data, is that protectionism almost always mutates into geopolitical conflict.
You start by banning cheap foreign steel or subsidizing your own chips, and you end up starving your neighbors and suffocating your own citizens' prosperity.
The data from 1933 is a glaring warning label on the bottle of protectionism. The mechanisms of state control over trade are almost always justified to the public as necessary safety measures.
But the receipts show a different story.
So what does this all mean for you? If you run a business, if you manage a supply chain, or even if you just buy groceries, your reality is dictated by these macroeconomic forces.
Exactly.
We now know definitively what the 1933 quotas did to the global economy. We know it destroyed the free market, amplified the depression, and accelerated the path to a catastrophic global conflict.
The math doesn't lie.
So when you wake up tomorrow and read the headlines, when you see the breaking news about sweeping new supply chain bans, massive national security tariffs, and politicians celebrating the restriction of global trade to protect domestic industries, I want you to ask yourself a chilling question.
It's the only question that matters.
Are you looking at a bold, necessary economic strategy for the future? Or are you just looking at a 1933 bacon quota dressed up in a 21st century suit? Thank you for taking this deep dive with us. Keep questioning the official narrative, demand to see the itemized receipts of history, and we'll see you next time.